Our scripture for this evening is actually the same scripture that we looked at last night. However, we will look at it from another angle, and that is Hebrews chapter 3, verses 12 and 13. Again, Hebrews chapter 3, verses 12 and 13. On last night, we looked at this passage and put emphasis on the word deceitfulness in verse 13. There is so much more in this text to look at that I thought it would be beneficial for us to consider this same passage again. As you are turning to Hebrews chapter 3, verses 12 and 13 will be under consideration for our study tonight. As you are turning there, I want you to think about radio stations, think about television stations. They all have these fancy names and call signs. You'll hear something like Kiss FM or Hot 97 or Night Moods. Then they have their call letters. Something interesting about call letters, for the most part, public radio uses K or W at the beginning of their call letters. This started actually before radio. It started with the telegram industry, and when the federal government started licensing radio stations, they adopted this same concept. So generally speaking, west of the Mississippi, call stations start with a with a K, and east of the Mississippi, they start with a W. For example, in Houston, you have KHOU. In Los Angeles, you have KTLA. Again, west of the Mississippi River, they start with a K. Then east of the Mississippi, you have places like Chicago, WGN, or in New York, WCBS, because the W is designated for stations east of the Mississippi River. There is one station that I want you to think about. I don't know if there is a radio station or television station in this country with these call letters, but there's a whole lot of people in the church with these call letters. WIFN. WIFM. What's in it for me? You know, people are very, very me, myself, and I oriented. And that's why we need to look at Hebrews chapter 3, verses 12 and 13 again. Take heed, brethren, lest there be in any of you an evil heart of unbelief in departing from the living God, but exhort one another daily while it is called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. Again, on last night we dealt with the latter part of verse 13. Tonight we'll deal with the first part, but exhort one another daily. In all of my years in the church, I have heard people stand up and make confessions about sin and have confessed every type of sin you can think of, except for one thing. I have never heard a person confess to being selfish. I've heard people say they've got a cursing problem or anger problem. I've heard people talk about sexual sins, fornication or adultery or gossiping. But I've never heard a person say, pray for me because I'm struggling with selfishness. Yet inherent in human nature is this flaw of being so me, myself, and I oriented that the Bible gives us this command to exhort one another daily. It is a challenge to us to get outside of ourselves and to minister, to serve, to work in the best interests of someone else. People must see the value in us investing in other people. Everything's not about us. It's not about who gets the spotlight. It's not about Did they sing the songs I like? Did they preach the sermon that fit me? Did I get selected for ministry? Did I get recognized? Did I get a thank you? Did I get affirmation? The Bible is calling us to do something that is drastically opposite of human nature, and not to think about WIFM, what's in it for me, but to think about what's in it for someone else. Human nature is bent on self-preservation, self-indulgence, and selfish pursuits. But look at this passage carefully and see the challenge to Christians to be more concerned with ministering to others. First of all, we need to develop a compassion for people. Acting in the interests of others emanates from a compassionate heart that takes concern and care in regards to the things that affect other people. It's not always that people don't have the capacity for compassion. Sometimes people are so busy looking at their interests that they don't always consider the interests of others. The Bible tells us in verse 12 that basically we are in danger of departing from the living God because of the things that are going on in our lives. The context of chapter 3 talks about the idea of hearing God's voice. It talks about the idea of not being in a position of provoking God and doing what people and the Israelites did in the wilderness and how they lost favor from God. And so we can become discouraged, we can become overwhelmed, we can be in such a place that it is possible that a heart of unbelief, a soul that is overwhelmed, a soul that is discouraged, can depart from the living God. And verse 13's point about exhorting one another means that we have to have compassion for what we see other people go through. We have to be concerned about the danger that people's souls are in. But that does not happen when we're not connected. You see, when it says exhort one another daily, the culture, the context of the time was that the early Christians were engaged in daily fellowship, daily interaction with one another. It is hard to be compassionate or concerned about people you're not connected with. So our fellowship has to exceed a once a week Sunday show up experience. Our fellowship has to be us on a journey together so that we feel what other people are going through. And when we exhort, the Bible teaches us to exhort. That means to build up, to strengthen. We have to do so seeking nothing in return. We have to do so because it's the right thing to do. Whether we are acknowledged or affirmed is irrelevant. Our blessings will come from God. Too many people have become discouraged because they have done some great deed and did not get a thank you. They have done some great deed and they were not acknowledged or affirmed in some kind of way. Do what is right for the sake of what is right. God promises that you will reap what you sow, but he does not promise that you reap where you sow. The good that you do will come back to you. Don't worry about where it comes from. You let the Lord handle his business and you handle yours. Make sure that in tuning to stations, you tune out of what's in it for me, WIFM, and tune in to serving others. Serving others is its own reward. This has been another installment of A Few Minutes with the Minister.